I'd like to start off by welcoming everyone to my second and final Ignite talk of my senior year. In my talk, I want to cover the main trials and eureka moments of my student teaching, and how these factors together inform my view of education, all of which comes to a head early on, thanks to an actual plague that shuts down everything indefinitely. But that first month of January, I sometimes like to compare to my 2-week period in my placement, North Oconee, when I foolishly believed it couldn't get much more stressful than this. Long days, piles of grading, and a constant barrage of micromanaging duties included, I quickly learned in that month that everything which gave me anxiety last semester was dialed up to 11. Early February was much the same as January, this time with essay grading and additional out-of-class reading for my students to work on. But something happened in mid-February for me, where I suddenly shifted into a new gear of teaching that I thought I would never hit during the school year. I began teaching lessons that not only had everyone engaged, they ensured that students were learning valuable skills. I noticed a difference in my students as well. Lessons seemed to have them more interested in what was going on. My students would ask me questions about what was happening next in the story, and even giving me predictions on what they felt like was going to occur. Some of my quietest students, the ones who sometimes I felt I would have to manually call upon to hear from, were really opening up to me in class. I realized that I had been focused on the wrong parts of teaching. I was so invested in trying to come up with questions and activities that tackled particular parts of the text rather than the skills involved in those activities. I was so focused on just teaching to the text that I forgot how many other outlets for teaching materials and tools existed out there. I've come to understand, beyond just knowing, that students come first and that the book comes second. The best time my students and I had with lessons were when everyone put their own feedback on a particular piece. Students giving their own answer for what is justice, arguing what they believe is good and evil about society. These are the moments that I absolutely live for. Feedback is also what I've begun to look into when I create lesson plans for my students. That ability for students to talk back to their assignments. I've begun to incorporate questions that I ask myself before I begin brainstorming, such as, what does student involvement look like? What about ideal student involvement? Do I think that students will be very engaged in this activity? How invested am I in the lesson that is being created? Am I invested? As funny as it sounds, this is a question that I would often neglect when I created lessons. Because of this, I began to get in the practice of testing out my own activities, as prescribed by my amazing mentor teacher. What I've come to learn is that if you're not confident about your own lessons, odds are that your students won't be either. Because student investment is so important, I need to make sure that I can measure it to some capacity in everything that I do. When I look back on some of my lessons in the semester, I realized that I can't think of how I was going to measure how well they were engaging with the text. This can be done with things like comprehension, inference questions, but the more I saw them pop up on bland worksheets, the less that I wanted to use them. I've come to a better understanding of the importance of consistent formative assessment, but simultaneously that the term formative allows for a great deal of creative ideas. I thought from the perspective of my students, watching for the moments in class when they seemed the most out of it. How could I keep their attention during these moments that didn't involve taking notes? How could I still get them to care about what was on the board or screen in front of them? To answer a question like this, I had to turn to a very different variable that I felt very scared about: digital tools. My cautiousness with using digital tools comes from my early belief that every tool should have a purpose rather than just being a gimmick. I didn't want to make a playlist assignment just because that's what's cool, or do a lot of video analysis. I learned after a solid year of my student teaching that digital tools can absolutely be gimmicks if you don't have purpose behind them, but that the reverse is also true. I remember the day when I tried Pear Deck for a presentation on gender roles in Romeo and Juliet, thinking that it would be nice for my students to use a new format of lesson. I didn't expect many of my students to already have experience with this tool, and I certainly didn't expect my students to be engaged with the lesson as they were. Free response questions sprinkled throughout, thought-provoking multiple choice, and choosing aside features helped keep the energy in the classroom. At a certain point in March, I felt as though I had lost a vast amount of opportunities to try out more of these methods that I hadn't capitalized on as much during the early part of this semester. Pear Deck would have proven far more effective for ensuring my students are still engaged with presentations, and incorporating more of my students' experience in their writing would make lessons far more applicable to them. The bigger point is that these are all points that I have heard before. Try and stay ahead on digital tools, connect students' experiences to their work, create work that you enjoy. However, it is easy to say these things inside the safety of the university classroom where ideas run wild and abstract. To take a risk and practice these ideas, putting work into making cohesive and fun lesson plans and utilizing emerging tools is something that I had to realize on my own. Whether or not we as teachers want to transition to these newer ideas about education, digital tools are quickly becoming something that has become less of an option to be used in the classroom. They are very soon becoming a necessity. More and more schools are gaining access to the one-to-one Chromebook feature, which allows for remote web surfing along with great opportunities for class-wide digital activities. But in there lies a deeper necessity for them. And a necessity for what happens when digital tools are all that our students have to work with. I never thought that my student teaching would end with me discussing The Odyssey and Lord of the Flies with them through Google Docs and Zoom, but it became the daily routine. Fluency in digital tools was so necessary that otherwise, how was I to teach my students the skills that they needed? How would I know if they learned? Just through a Google Doc submission? The sheer idea of the unknown that would face me and my students for the remainder of the semester was daunting. Is this really how it was meant to end? How would we do our research essays? How would I continue to ensure that they have access to everything they needed? How could we say that we could still teach them, even if we weren't face-to-face? And this is where the final point about what I believe I need for teaching resides. What I believe about the profession of teaching and where it will take me. Teaching can be described as either a series of events that result in drawbacks, standstills, or in much smaller cases, golden opportunities for growth. These kinds of situations just cannot be anticipated, and nor should you always live in fear of something that you cannot foresee occurring. My mentor teacher has given me a piece of advice that will always stick with me in these situations where I feel as though I cannot serve my students to the best of my ability. Draw back and punt. Regroup and try again with the lessons I've learned as an educator. The ability to teach is always there. The ability to improve my students' understanding of complex text is there because I've accomplished that. Dealing with situations like COVID-19, while totally novel, is something that we as teachers must all deal with by working with the tools that we have. I believe teaching is a constant journey with our students, one that they play a part in helping with. Teaching is and always will be a constant battle with obstacles throughout, but it can always be overcome with creativity and drive. Thank you.